So Santo Trafficante Sr., shows up on the scene around 1940, but he's been in Tampa. He immigrates from Sicily in 1902. But there's very little known about his early life. He was a cigar maker for a time. He starts showing up ties to Ignazio Antinori and another early mafia boss, Ignazio Italiano. But there's very little known about Santo Trafficante Sr.'s early life, and it isn't until about 1940, mid-1940s, that he starts showing up more in law enforcement reports and intelligence files. But even then, there's very little about him in the paper. He's definitely one of those typical really old school mafia guys that there's very little known about because they've really kind of kept a low profile and out of the spotlight. But by the time he passes away in 1954, he had already handed the reins over to his son Santo Jr. a few years prior. So there's a bigger article when he passes away, and he's described as one of the kingpins of the underworld. But by then, there have been congressional hearings. There's been other stuff that's come out over the years about Santo Sr., but not much about his rise. So it's really an area that definitely more research needs to be done on. So in about 1950, there was a little bit of a resurgence of violence here in Tampa, and a lot of it, and it was internal. It was an intra-family war. There were a couple factions that were vying for control, and one of them was led by Salvatore Red Italiano and another guy, Jimmy Lumia. And on June 5th, 1950, Jimmy Lumia was shot and killed while he was sitting in his car. And a few months later, Salvatore Italiano fled Tampa for Italy, New Orleans, and eventually settled in Mexico City, never returning to Tampa. So with that, Santo Trafficante Jr. really solidifies his power, but even throughout the 1950s, there's other gangland killings, and Santo Jr. himself is shot in 1953, wounded in the arm in Ybor City. But during this time, a couple things Santo Jr. does. He is able to inherit his father's connections with mafia figures in other parts of the country. So Santo Trafficante Sr. Had connections to the Profaci family, the Mangano family in New York City. He had connections to Chicago, very close connections to mobsters in New Orleans. And when his son took over, Santo Jr., he was able to maintain these close connections with mafia figures in other parts of the country. The other thing he did was he inherited and expanded the Tampa mob's operations in Havana. And by that time, in post-World War II Havana, American tourism had really started taking off. So by the mid-1950s, Santo Trafficante Jr. actually relocates for a period of time to Havana and becomes one of the most notable and powerful mobsters and casino owners in Havana, Cuba, probably second only to Meyer Lansky. So in 1957, Trafficante was in the news a few times. Chief among those was the ill-fated Appalachian meeting in upstate New York, where representatives from all the mafia families gathered at the estate of Joseph Barbara, who's a member of the Pittston-Scranton Mafia. And when state troopers came up to the house, all the mobsters took off into the woods and they ended up arresting all of them. They charged him with some vagrancy and some other charges, but that really put a lot of them on the front page of the paper. Among those was a Luis Santos from Cuba, who was Santo Trafficante. He gave a false name. There was also the killing of Albert Anastasia, which happened in New York City in October of '57 at the Park Sheraton Hotel. And just the night before he was killed, Anastasia was meeting with Santo Trafficante about operations in Cuba. And there was suspicion that Trafficante might have had something to do with Anastasia's killing, and he was in fact subpoenaed by the New York District Attorney in Manhattan. And though it's come out in later years that Anastasia's killing was more of an internal family thing that was going on and not really related to Trafficante or Cuba. But January 1st, 1959 is when Fidel Castro kind of rides into Havana and takes over Cuba. And there's this common misconception that he kicked the gangsters out and closed all the casinos immediately. That's partially true. A lot of the gangsters chose to leave when Castro took over, and he did initially close the casinos, but he reopened them about a month later because a lot of the Cubans that worked there wanted them to reopen because that was their livelihood. The problem was the tourists weren't coming. But there was one mobster who stayed behind, and that was Santo Trafficante, and he figured that he can try to make it work with Castro. Part of that was he had a lot of money invested in these casinos. He didn't want to just give that up. The other thing was that Fidel Castro, many years prior, had come to Tampa to do fundraising. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that he met with the Traficantes to get some funds. And there's a lot of evidence that the Mafia were also supplying Castro with guns, military jeeps, money, and other supplies. Kind of playing both sides of the coin. They were, giving money to Batista, giving money to Castro, figuring whoever came to power, they would be able to work with them. But, early '59, Castro jails Trafficante in prison in the Triscornia Detention Center. It's the only time that Trafficante Sr. or Jr. or any boss of the Tampa Mafia have ever spent any time in prison, was that brief period in Cuba in '59. When Trafficante gets released from prison in Cuba, he comes back to the United States, but by that time his notoriety is really very high, and he doesn't feel welcome in Tampa because of intense law enforcement pressure. So he relocates and actually spends a good deal of time in the 1960s living in Miami, which is the place to be in the 1960s. One of the interesting things when Trafficante was in prison in 1959 in Cuba was, and I've talked to a few people, including Gerald Hemming, who was in the prison at the same time, was he was visited by a couple guys. One of them was Louis McWillie, who worked for Trafficante at one of his casinos. The other visitor was a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. So, whatever conspiracy theory you want to, tie your horse to, the fact that the killer of Lee Harvey Oswald's in Cuba 4 years prior visiting Trafficante is kind of interesting.